Welcome, everyone, to Critical Theory and Social Justice's podcast series, The Matrix. My name is Malik Muazzam Dolat. I'm a professor in Critical Theory and Social Justice, and today we have a very special guest, but I'm just going to introduce my colleague, Professor Caroline Heldman, who will be introducing our guest. So let's go ahead and get started.
Thank you, Professor Muazzam Dolat. It is my pleasure to introduce Professor Taifha Natalie Alexander, a Georgetown law graduate who will be speaking to us about the political campaign against critical race theory. I know there's a lot of interest in this topic, so I expect that this video will be widely shared. Professor Alexander's passion for building coalitions and their appreciation for diversity stems from the racial and ethnic diversity of her own family. She hopes to inspire and challenge stereotypes and biases through her scholarship and her overall career. And her focus on legal studies has been a particular focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion. Just a little bit more about Professor Alexander. To accomplish this goal, she presents at conferences around the country to discuss the issues that frustrate institutions and their ability to create inclusive climates. She also focuses on providing tangible tools to create an inclusive climate. Professor Alexander is presented at the National Association of African American Studies, their annual conference at NASPA, and the Mellon Diversity Conference at Queens College. So with no further ado, let's do a warm welcome.
Yeah. Okay.
Before I begin, I just want to thank everyone for being here. I want to thank you, Professor Heldman, and also the faculty at the Critical Theory and Social Justice program. And so I will be sharing today a resource developed by my colleagues and I at UCLA School of Law, which is the CRT Forward Tracking Project. But before I share more about the project itself, I want to acknowledge my colleagues who couldn't be here physically, but maybe they're here via Zoom. And these are our knowledge producers on the project. And they are responsible for ensuring the maintenance, accuracy, and overall comprehensiveness of this database that I'm going to share with you in a few moments. So with that being said, in the time that I have today, I'm going to talk a little bit more about what critical race theory is, the attacks on it, and also this resource of the CRT Forward Tracking Project, which is one of the 3 critical components of CRT Forward. Okay. So now let's get started. Hopefully, I'm not over your Okay. So before we begin, I first want to provide some context for the current moment we're in and how critical race theory, or CRT for short, has been distorted in the media. Then I'm going to provide a definition of the theory, how it came to be, and a few of its contributions. So to help us get started, let me see this one.
Oh, it's misbehaving. There we go.
All right, this isn't operational, so I'm going to move on. But essentially, imagine that Professor Kimberly Crenshaw says some brilliant things that she always does. And essentially what she articulates in this video is that critical race theory recognizes the importance of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, but critical race theory also asks, well, wait a minute. If the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was doing what it was written to do, then why is it 4 years later, John Carlos and Tommie Smith raised their fists in solidarity with Black Americans at the 1968 Olympics, right? And so critical race theory provided a framework for understanding the lived experience of Black Americans at first in 1968 by interpreting the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the law that guaranteed certain protections and found that Black Americans were still being subject to inadequate housing, food insecurity, and barriers to economic freedom. And anti-racist scholars founded critical race theory as this practice of seeing connections between America's racial history and present-day inequality. For example, critical race theory allows us to recognize the connection between the history of societal issues that led to the disobedience of 1968 Olympians John Carlos and Tommie Smith, as well as the societal issues that led to the civil disobedience of our 2020 Lakers. So in addition to recognizing these connections, critical race theory is committed to liberation or changing the ways in which law produces racial inequality. So relatedly, critical race theory does something that few other practices do. It allows people of color and people from historically marginalized groups to tell our own stories of struggles and triumphs, of ebbs and flows, to ensure and to advocate for the advancement of racial equality. And so speaking of stories, I want to share a personal story with you. So in 2006, I was blessed with the title I covet the most, and it is Auntie Taifha. Oh. And that was when my nephew was born. And it's a title that I take seriously most of the time, right? Mm-hmm. And so up until I moved to DC for law school, we were inseparable, but that distance did not impact our bond. In fact, in 2018, my nephew and mom walked me down the aisle on my wedding day. And later during the reception, my nephew and I spent most of the night tearing up the dance floor, doing the kid and play. And when I was creating this presentation, I realized I couldn't not have a photo of that. So what I have realized lately, though, is that my nephew isn't a kid anymore. And so in October, he flew from New York to LA to visit. And because he's a teenager now, traveling by himself in airports with some police presence, my sister, his mom, decided it was time to have the talk with him. And so this sort of talk might not be the one that you're thinking about, but it's one that many caregivers of color have to have with their children, and Black children in particular. And it's all about how to best behave during police interactions. And, you know, for those of you who are not familiar with the talk, it usually involves telling children of color, and even more specifically Black children, not to wear certain types of clothing, what to say, what not to say, where to place their hands, instructions on not making swift movements, or better yet, no movements at all. And under no circumstances are they to run from the police. And in some instances, if we hold positions of influence, we oftentimes tell our children to tell the police that information as well, with the hope that that knowledge in our absence might save them. And so while this experience of having the talk may not be the lived experience of all Black people, it is the reality for many. And so in understanding this reality, critical race scholar Devin Carbato's work has, among other things, analyzed outdated stop and frisk policies and how the framework of the Fourth Amendment has created a system that encourages police encounters within Black communities. And some of these encounters end in the senseless loss of life, as we have seen too many times before, which leads many Black caregivers to have this talk in the first place, right? So in this instance, critical race theory is using a legal analysis to figure out how the law has created a social reality where Black people are having the talk with their Black child and advocates for an outcome that would advance racial inequality. So we wouldn't have a world in which the talk would even have to happen, right? And so this is just one example of the utility of critical race theory. There are unfortunately many other examples of how the practice of analyzing the law to demonstrate racial inequality within the social reality of people who have been marginalized and advocate for change can come about, right? So one example can be found in an article that I wrote where I explained that evidence law uses general rap lyrics as evidence of a crime without more, And that in itself is wrong because rap, lyric, hip hop has been this expression of poetry, of lived experience, and to criminalize people for that is not okay. And what we've seen recently is Congress implementing laws and passing bills that might be able to curb against that behavior. But just to put it into context, no one's going to arrest or imprison Mr. Johnny Cash for, quote, shooting a man in Reno, right? And so in essence, one of the most influential contributions of critical race theory is that as a practice, it provides people with the opportunity to better understand how we have come to the current social realities in our shared space and time, and allows for scholars to be able to share our testimony, analyze the historical context of our lived social realities, and find ourselves in a place where we can advocate for some justice. And so as a result, critical race theory shines a light on some of the historic atrocities that have been skipped over or haven't been laid fully bare for deeper analysis. And so talking about deeper analysis, shortly after the horrific murder of George Floyd, many people began to engage in the practice of this deeper analysis. Many people ask themselves, how are my actions or inactions contributing to the structural racism that resulted in this televised killing, right? CEOs, college administrators, educators, and politicians were also asking themselves the same question. And all over the world, large multiracial groups of activists across class and lived experience demanded change. And so many school districts, officials, and teachers answered these demands. And some school districts issued statements of support for Black Lives Matter. Educators and government officials participated in more diversity and anti-bias trainings. This is what we saw happening specifically in K through 12 education, where people were updating their curriculum to counter anti-racism, to hire diversity officials, to all of these actions that were taking place. Some teachers, even like Amy Donofrio here, placed a Black Lives Matter flag in her classroom, which consists of, or the school itself consisted of over 90% Black students. People started incorporating Nicole Hannah Jones's work, the 1619 Project. And so what we saw was this global movement among teachers to be more intentional about what it was they were teaching and who they were including in their lessons plans to ensure that students weren't robbed of the truth of their collective history. And so the promise of this transformational racial justice reform was unfortunately short-lived. Extremists and architects of what we now know as the CRT disinformation campaign were concerned that people, but mostly students in particular, were now grappling with the country's racialized history. And that requires that we take a deep, hard look at ourselves and figure out who we are and who we want to be as a country. And so this level of reflection has the capacity to shift contemporary society, ensure the liberation of people from historically subordinated groups, and guarantees the country can fulfill its potential of truly becoming a multiracial democracy. And Christopher Rufo, an architect of the anti-CRT campaign, was aware of that fact. He's a fellow at the Heritage Foundation, which is a right-wing think tank, and one of these main figures behind pushing disinformation around CRT. And he himself has even stated his goal, which is outlaid here, in that to have the public read something crazy and immediately assign it to critical race theory. And this could be anything from teaching, training, classroom decorations, anything to do with race at all, especially sharing information about the horrors of enslavement or forced relocation of Indigenous peoples or LGBTQ plus affirming materials, as well as things that could just advance diversity or inclusion more generally, right? And so this disinformation campaign essentially robs students, our next generation of leaders and experts, of a truthful history and any hope of ensuring a better, more just future for everyone. So it's also important to note that this CRT disinformation campaign is part and parcel of a larger project to erode civil and human rights. When you look at voters' rights protections being eroded, abortion rights, laws targeting trans children and ensuring that they can receive gender affirming care in certain localities are all part of this drudging up of a fear and creating a boogeyman essentially where one does not exist. And really reclaiming for some groups this political power is really important, which is a trend that we've already seen in the CRT Forward tracking project. So the tracking project is an up-to-date, easily accessible clearinghouse of local, state, and federal government activity aimed at limiting access to truthful information about systemic racism through a campaign to reject critical race theory. And so this anti-CRT activity at the local, state, and federal levels is not only identified and tracked, but also substantively analyzed to better determine which types of institutions are being targeted, like, for example, K through 12 education or state and federal government agencies, the type of conduct that's being regulated, like, for example, teaching or curricular surveillance, the specific features of the prohibition or requirement, like, for example, if CRT, the 1619 project, or certain divisive concepts are specifically being named. And so we're also interested in tracking any enforcement provisions. So, for example, if a teacher is found to be teaching about critical race theory, is it possible that they can then be sued, or will the school district be subject to fines or even their funding withheld altogether? So through this resource, we've been able to track 522 different anti-CRT measures, which is an extreme number. But it's relevant to discuss here because all of these activity are in direct response to the movement that we saw in the summer of 2020. Have a few more slides really quickly. So this image right here on the left is showing you a representation of the map on our website where any sort of anti-CRT measure was introduced and failed. And so where the states that are white and then baby blue demonstrates where things were introduced or not introduced. So the lighter colors, nothing was introduced there. But the light blue colors are where things were introduced and failed. But on the next image, what you're looking at is all of the places where measures were introduced and adopted. And I'll share a little bit more about those numbers in a second. So as I mentioned, there are 522 measures, 90% of them target K through 12 education. And then for this one, for every one rejected anti-CRT measure, there have been 4 to 5 that have been enacted. So it's kind of putting a whole new lens on this idea that it takes a lie 4 times to travel the globe before the truth has time to catch up. And so another thing that I wanted to share with you all really quickly was that what we have found through our data sets is that there are candidates who are running for elections who are utilizing a blueprint like this one, right? So they're going out and they're running a campaign on being anti-CRT, then they receive funding from a well-funded anti-CRT political action. Yep, there you go. And then they commit to implementing anti-CRT measures and then rinse and repeat for re-elections. And so through our database, we found multiple instances of this, but I wanted to lift one up for you all in particular. So this is the school board candidates, 4 candidates in Douglas County, and they were up for election in 2021. And they ran on platform values like transparency and integrity, and putting kids first, and parents' choice, which are all terms that we have now understood through this disinformation campaign to be oppositional to what critical race theory is, because the term has been co-opted and redefined in so many ways. And so these candidates were able to run on a platform of those values. And then they were able to secure their election essentially through help from the 1776 Project Act, which is the only national school board specific political action committee. And their goal is to support school board candidates that vow to overturn any teaching of the 1619 Project or critical race theory in their school district. And since this PAC has been organized, they have won 75% of all the elections that they have invested in. And through their support, our Colorado school board candidates were able to raise over $300,000 in funding, which was nearly $200,000 more than their opponents. And then so shortly after winning their election on a 4-3 vote, an anti-CRT measure was passed. So what essentially happened was this 4-candidate board was able to overwhelm the other members of the board and essentially revoke an educational equity policy that, you know, people who went to the board meeting and discussed it were very invested in. And so if you were to navigate, if you were interested in learning about what's going on in California, for example, or any other state in the country, you'd be able to navigate to the website, look at the measure. It's not enough for us to just tell you this is targeting K through 12, but we give you the PDF document so that you can look at this yourself, because transparency is important. Just 2 more things. So if you're a data person, this might jump out at you like, yes, I want to get my hands dirty on the data. If you're not a data person and you went to law school because you're not a data person, one of the things that we have on our website are these contextualizing subpages. And so we lift up the data in certain points where it's important to share trends. So you should check that out when you have a chance. And then we're also looking forward to creating a litigation table on our website. So a lot of good people at the ACLU, at the LDF, and other organizations are bringing challenges to a lot of these measures. And then there are also some people that are bringing challenges that are in support of these measures. So we want to be able to provide that information to the public, while also additionally highlighting some of the other data set points that we have. Like, for example, when a teacher gets fired because they have how to be an anti-racist in the classroom, or when a program gets their funding pulled because it's accused of having CRT in it. Those sorts of things are what we're looking to provide, as well as publishing a tracking project report. So that's all I have, and I'll answer any questions that you all may have.
Thank you. That's awesome. That's awesome.
Question about, so the anti-CRT movement, I have a question about the other backlash aspects against the 2020 uprising. Can you talk to us about how this is situated in all this, wide array of efforts?
Yeah.
Push back against the movement?
Right. So like I mentioned in the presentation, the anti-CRT campaign is just one piece of a larger puzzle. And so when you think back to the summer of 2020 and the bills that were being introduced in state legislatures, Florida specifically had a bill where they were challenging people's right to protest, people's right to assembly. And, you have to look at these things in context, right? So there were people in the street protesting, demanding, for their rights and demanding to be listened to. So that's like another piece. I did a session with some of my colleagues at UCLA called Branches of the Same Vine. So how this relates to the LGBTQ erosion of rights and ensuring visibility of students who identify in the community is connected to this movement, which is also connected to the abortion rights movement as well, right? And so what I have seen and what I have analyzed is that the attacks on CRT was the first wave, right? And so a lot of what is happening now can be understood as to looking back to how the anti-CRT campaign was so pervasive and so effective for those extremists that are part of the anti-CRT movement. So does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Is that helpful?
So we have a Zoom guest question real quick.
Okay.
It's well, hold on. There we go. So it's from well, we won't say who it is. Will the project's January 2022 detailed report by Pollock and Rogers be replicated?
So their report was in January 21. I mean, yes, January 22, that is correct. So it's not, there are different parameters, right? So the Pollock report, which was done by our colleagues at University of California, San Diego and UCLA School of Education, was focused on how these anti-CRT measures are impacting teachers in the classroom. And so while we do focus on that somewhat, our measures or how we are identifying anti-CRT is a bit different, right? So for the CRT Forward Tracking Project, we're very much interested on measures that have been formally introduced, whereas the Pollock report is looking at any discussion of CRT. So where a school board might have discussed CRT but not passed a resolution or a measure on it specifically, we are not capturing that information, right? We're only capturing things that are introduced formally. And so our report has shown us, or our tracking of this data has shown us a lot of interesting things that the Pollock report didn't have the capacity to, even though it's like a robust 90-page report. What we have found is that a lot of the media around the anti-CRT movement has been concentrated in conservative or red states, right? And so a lot of times what then happens is, I'm from New York, so my New York friends are like, oh, that's, you know, Texas is going to Texas. When in reality, there are 2 bills that were introduced in New York. And even though they didn't pass, the impact of introducing them has resulted in some sort of chilling effect that we understand. And our report is going to delve deeper into those things. Like, for example, in California, there have been 9 measures that have been introduced and 6 that have passed. And so if the Pollock report didn't necessarily look at those measures and the impact there, and that's something that we're definitely going to do in our report.
Excellent.
Okay.
So just quickly, this is like a more specific question towards like an area in the US. So the Northeast, it's kind of known as like the center of education. If you may, like New York, Boston, it's where like a lot of the Ivy's concentrated, especially New England. And I was wondering, since that area is like considered the center of education and it has a lot of the prestigious institutions, is CRT something that is, I guess, like not really supported, but like, I don't find the word, but like promoted or encouraged due to the fact they're in such an academic location?
That's a great question. So our database is not at the point yet where we're tracking pro CRT activity. So I wouldn't be able to answer that question directly. But what I can say is that of all the states in the continental US, the only state that hasn't introduced an anti-CRT measure based on the parameters that we found, is Delaware. So there's activity everywhere. But some of my colleagues at the African American Policy Forum are engaged in this work of pro-CRT and supporting and ensuring that college faculty in particular have the tools that they need to sign on to a resolution, for example, that supports the teaching of critical race theory and supports academic freedom in that way. Yeah.
Thank you for your talk.
Yeah. Sure.
So I think that one of the reasons that CRT disinformation is so successful in the legal and policymaking arena is because it resonates with so many people at the social level, like in social media, or
Yeah.
even contexts like this, maybe
Mhm.
on college campuses,
Yeah.
even in the, what did you call it? The academic center.
Yeah.
I bristle at that because there's so much that's in California too, but either way, I think that social disinformation, and particularly what I've seen in those contexts, is the setting up of false dichotomies.
Yeah.
So what I'm wondering is if you have any recommendations for how to be pro CRT, but also counter CRT disinformation in those kinds of contexts. And I want to give you a specific example that's applicable to Oxy. So next week, a group of faculty and students are bringing some external speakers to campus, one of whom is an Oxy alum, who's the founder of an organization called the Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism. Sounds good. You go and you click, are you familiar with the organization?
I know where you're going.
Yeah.
With this.
So you go and you click on their website, they have this slick video that's talking about why focusing on identity is actually racist and we should all be pro-human because there's only one human race. And so you watch the video and I could see being easily convinced that, yeah, we should be anti-racist, which means that we shouldn't be doing CRT and we shouldn't be doing identity-based work. So how do you battle that kind of thing within a social sphere?
It's a big question. First, I want to lift up what you said about this, like playing on the language, right? And so a lot of the anti-CRT measures that we saw at first were essentially mimicking Executive Order 13950, which is oftentimes referred to as the equity gag order, which is with the executive order that banned teaching of diversity and equity inclusion in the federal government and for certain contractors. And that's what kind of launched this anti-CRT movement from a legal standpoint anyway. And so, there are some divisive concepts in there that are then falsely attributed to critical race theory. And so that's the co-opting that happened, right? To redefine the term and then to make it so just toxic that people wouldn't want to associate themselves with it anymore. And that's something that we saw, right? Because in a lot of K through 12 and sometimes higher education contexts, we saw people saying, well, wait, we're not teaching CRT. We're not doing that here, which some people thought was helpful, but was essentially harmful because if you're distancing yourself from a thing, it demonstrates that you don't want to be a part of it. And so now what we have seen is that legislatures and certain school boards have been introducing measures that claim like this is anti-racist. And so we're not going to have these discussions. We're not going to do these things because doing that would be racist. So it's equivocating anti-racism to racism, right? And so that move is something that we've seen. And so my suggestion for that is to call it out for what it is, right? This allowing for this narrative to be pushed is something that is helping the anti-CRT campaign maintain its effectiveness. And so what I would suggest is let's dive deeper into what it is you're really saying. The color blindness aspect of it is something that CRT is especially critical of, because then we don't have the opportunity to discuss where systemic racism is coming into play and creating these differences in experiences based on identity. I get the appeal of it as well, but it's very dangerous, in my opinion, because if you're not teasing those things out, if you're not calling it for what it is, then you're able to perpetuate a system that has been in place for centuries in this country and across the world. So that would be my advice, to really dig into what's being said, to be critical of it, and to really analyze where there are gaps in this like logic, to be able to, I guess, because I'm a legally trained person, I guess, to be able to, you know, basically be able to liberate ourselves from it. That's a really deep question, and I'm going to continue to think about it, because it is something that we have found, and that some of my colleagues in particular are very interested in, especially Cheryl Harris. This whole movement of anti-racism is racism, it runs kind of counter to the First Amendment in particular, but yeah, so thank you for your question. Thank you. Sure.
I have a question about actions folks can take. So I guess two questions. One, can students intern with this project or do something with the project to advance it? And then the second question is, what advice do you give to everyone here to fight the anti-CRT even on a daily basis?
Perfect questions. Okay, so your first question first. There is opportunity to get engaged and to be involved with the project. And so people can reach out to me directly, and I'll share my information with you all so that you can share it with others. What is particularly useful for me on the project is to have people play around with the website if things don't make sense and things like that. That's helpful. It's also helpful for me to be aware of new trends that are happening. So the way in which we gather our data is through US news reports. So we go through legal systems like Lexis and Westlaw in order to gather up a whole bunch of articles, and through those articles identify the source material for the anti-CRT measure itself. And so sometimes we're not capturing everything, and so it would be helpful to be able to know about things outside of those reports. The second thing, how to combat this thing. This is pervasive, right? 522 different measures. And a lot of times people get, I guess, overwhelmed a little bit by just the magnitude of it all. But what's unique, I think, about the tracking project and other resources like it is that you now have the information to be able to combat some things. You now know where a certain school board might be talking about a measure that they're thinking about introducing, right? And so there is opportunity to create some advocacy and activism around that there. And so I'm not saying go to your local school board and derail the whole thing, but what I am saying is that information is powerful, and that's what this tracking project does. And so I would encourage people to look at what's going on in their home state through the project. Maybe write some letters if you're inclined to, call some people if you can, you know, let your senator know what you're thinking, or any of your elected officials. And so that's one thing that people could do on the project side. Another thing is that being from New York and going to law school in DC and now living in California, I've kind of got the whole liberal location down. So I think it is important to know what's going on in those places too, because there is activity. And so knowing that and articulating that and getting people to care about that is also extremely important. Understanding what CRT is and what it isn't is also important. because the narrative that has been pushed on the CRT disinformation campaign side has been so effective. And so coming to things like this, supporting your program, I'm seeing lots of
Yes.
questions / comments. So I'll wrap it up there.
A follow-up to what you said, which who is the person you mentioned who's doing the anti-racism as a form of racism, someone at your
Yeah,
program?
so that's something. So the CRT Forward tracking project has a whole slew of faculty who I will shout out now. So Noah Zatch, Cheryl Harris, Latoya Baldwin-Clark, and others who are thinking about how we might want to respond to these things, right? So one part of the project is to study this phenomenon that's going on, which is what the tracking project does. But another part is to see what critical race theory has to say about this particular thing. And for those of you who are familiar with critical race theory, it is very much 14th Amendment, 4th Amendment, equal protection, those sorts of things. And so now we're interested in a foray, if you will, into the First Amendment, which there is some scholarship about the First Amendment and how it interacts with race, but not very much. And so that's what we're doing as colleagues, trying to think about what the First Amendment and what critical race theory has to say about this particular moment under the context of the First Amendment.
Great. One of our guests points out that Ballotopedia's hall pass feature has good data coverage on school board results as well.
That's great.
Yeah,
That's
just in
awesome.
case anyone wanted to look into that. And then some specifics that then became complicated in the next one. So we'll
Okay.
let that sort out later.
Okay.
So any further questions? How about you all? Thoughts? You good? Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you for your time. Thanks for coming.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody, for coming by on the busiest Thursday of the semester. I really appreciate it. And so we'll have this. Let me just stop this. I gotta